Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to you all at our first talk of this festival, and a special welcome to our Zoom audience who are here with us as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Lynne Gooby to you as our speaker. Lynne was a most successful headmistress at the Royal School, and she bred a culture where people sort of wanted to learn in a happy atmosphere. And it's a great tribute to her how well the school did. Now, Lynne's subject is English. So at every festival, I persuade her to talk about something that will interest her and myself. I think who is Shakespeare is a wonderful topic. And so I'm going to hand over now to Lynne.
Thank you, Hamish, and I think we should all thank Hamish because there wouldn't be a festival in Haslemere without him. Hamish. Hamish, the only begetter of our festival. So as you know, he loves anniversaries, and 2023 is the 400th anniversary of the publication of the first folio. And you can't miss it, can you? Because it's everywhere. There's a new book about it, I noticed in the High Street bookshop. It's been in all of the media for the last several months. And it's a collection of all of Shakespeare's poems and all of the plays, with the exception of Troilus and Cressida. There had been other smaller, cheaper quarto versions of some of the plays, roughed together from various sources. But this prestigious edition, compiled by Shakespeare's colleagues, Henry Condell and John Hemmings, about 7 years after his death, it has become the defining document. About 750 copies were printed, of which 233 survive, 82 of which are in the Folio Library in Washington. It was a deluxe edition, and some Puritan clerics complained that it was printed on extremely good quality paper, better than that used by printers of the Bible. And it cost £1, which was a very substantial sum. So it was clearly intended probably for institutions and aristocrats rather than for anybody else. So the dedication was written by Ben Jonson, who will feature in this from time to time. It was dedicated to the two Earl brothers, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. And this is what Ben Jonson said about this likeness of Shakespeare, which has been so much criticised ever since. It's been suggested that the head is on back to front, that the ear is backwards, that the head is twice the size of the body. However, this is what Ben Jonson said about it. This figure that thou art here, feast put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Could he but have drawn his wit as well as frass as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever in frass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but on his book. And he later, in his preface, describes Shakespeare's writings as such as neither man nor muse can praise too much. And the famous phrase, the soul of the age, is also taken from that document. So, like most people of my generation, I studied plays by Shakespeare at school, and I enjoyed the stories about him starting off holding horses' heads for playgoers in London, a country boy in the city. I also have to confess that I've taken many school parties to the RSC in Stratford and the Globe, to the birthplace, to Mary Arden's house. No, that's Anne Hathaway's cottage, and to Mary Arden's house, and retold the scant details of the life of Will of Stratford many times. However, the preparation I've done for this talk takes me in a different direction and has forced me to consider the arguments in favour of an alternative author. There are many candidates worthy of consideration, some less so. For example, Queen Elizabeth, I don't think it was her. And I have confessed already my own assumptions based on my education and long-held opinion, but I must also say that research has thrown up many puzzles which cast doubt on those assumptions. There are simply too many gaps in the evidence. but this does apply to all of the candidates. In the time available today, I cannot consider many of them, but it would take a lifetime actually wading through the millions of words written on the subject. However, I have been struck by what I believe to be the importance of the personal and intellectual context behind two of the anti-Stratfordian candidates. And I should say I've become more than ever aware of the effect of personal prejudice and experience in assessing any argument at all, whatever it is. And I will try to avoid it. I've confessed my prejudices already, so I hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to consider two with a slight reference to a third of the 87 proposed alternative candidates. So I'm going to begin with Francis Bacon, Chancellor of England, and Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and I will mention Sir Henry Neville briefly. This is a snapshot of a vast subject, and I've chosen the most prominent possibilities in the order in which their candidacy has come to public notice. And it's worth noting that the success of various arguments has been at least partly dependent on the means of publicity. All of these proposals began with a book, but in addition, the Baconian magazine was published between 1886 and 1999, when it finally withered away. Neville's candidacy was revealed in a book as recently as 2005. And the De Vere Society, or Oxfordians, as they're sometimes called, have benefited from the IT revolution. It began with a book, but since its revival in the 1970s, it's attracted the support of a number of theatrical luminaries and produces a very lively website and series of events. Its tone is assertive, not to say strident. It describes those who believe in Will of Stratford as being, and I quote, and I think I know who wrote this, and by the way, a special welcome to two members of the De Vere Society sitting in the front row. Anyway, I think this is written by Alexander Waugh, Oberon Waugh's son, and you might even pick up the Waugh tone. Oh, that's a pun, isn't it? We are a light squadron of sentimentalists irrevocably attached to their childhood dreams and ideals, a motley platoon of those whose salaries are dependent on the survival of the orthodox narrative. In order to avoid this imputation, I have approached this question with as open a mind as I can, and I will begin by paying some attention to the context in which these authorship theories arose. In at least two of the cases, the zeitgeist is probably very influential. So the arguments against the authorship of Will of Stratford are many, but they fall into two main categories. How could a provincial boy from a largely illiterate background possibly have the knowledge and experience reflected in the writing? Secondly, why is there so little documentary evidence of his existence as a writer? We know that he was a partner in a successful theatrical enterprise, that he performed minor roles in some of the plays, that he made enough money to fund a prosperous retirement in his hometown. However, no book or script has come to light with his name on it. He left no books in his will, and the scant documentary evidence concerns mostly property deals and litigation. In his day, Shakespeare's plays were performed on the road, in the newly built public theatres, at court, whether it be at Whitehall, Greenwich or Windsor, and for the delight of the lawyers in the Inns of Court, until 1642. The Civil War and the Puritan rule of Parliament closed down the theatres completely, and the Restoration in 1660 brought with it a renaissance of the arts, including a new and exuberant style of drama and the unheard appearance of real women on the stage. The new was all the rage, and for a brief period, Shakespeare went out of fashion. It was during the 18th century that the deification of Shakespeare began, largely because of the work of the great actor and theatre manager David Garrick. His performance as Richard III was stellar, and in the more naturalistic style favoured by Hamlet in his advice to the players. He left behind the bombastic declamatory style of previous generations and laid the foundations for interpretations that we would recognise today. Garrick built a temple to Shakespeare on the banks of the Thames at his house at Hampton, and in 1769 he mounted a Shakespeare Jubilee at Stratford. Unfortunately, it poured with rain every day and was a literal washout, so he did it a month later at his theatre in Drury Lane. And his status as the greatest actor of his age is apparent in the number, oh, that's the globe, of course, in the number of portraits. There are many portraits of Garrick, places named after him, and his final resting place in Westminster Abbey. And his real achievement was in repositioning Shakespeare in the centre of British culture. And the Bernard Levin quotes I put up earlier are just to remind all of us how deeply embedded the texts of Shakespeare's plays are in our subconscious, and we're largely unaware of the number of times that we quote him. There's a lovely story of two ladies leaving a performance of Hamlet at Stratford, and one saying to the other, "I did rather enjoy it, but why did he fill it full of those quotes?" What we might call the Shakespeare industry sprung up in the wake of Garrick's work. Some researchers were scholarly and some commercial. Forgeries appeared of letters and plays allegedly in the poet's hand. Learned analyses of the plays began to focus on the range of knowledge reflected in the texts, whose author had left so little personal information behind. His daughter Judith's three sons died in childhood. I think we all know that his one son died aged 11, and Susanna's daughter died childless in 1662, leaving no living relative to pass on family stories, which might have filled in some of the gaps. Anti-Stratfordians insist that there is no evidence to link Will of Stratford with the life of theatre at all. But actually, there is something written by the curate who arrived. The curate arrived in Stratford in the same year that his daughter died. And he may have known her. He certainly knew people who did know her. And he was an amateur antiquarian, and he wrote this: "I have heard that Mr. Shakespeare was a natural wit without any art at all. He frequented the plays all his younger time, but in his elder days lived at Stratford and supplied the stage with 2 plays every year. And for that he had an allowance so large that he spent at the rate of 1,000 a year, as I have heard. Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drunk too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted." I'm sure you've all heard versions of that before. But Ben Jonson's intemperate ways led to the death of Shakespeare. One of the, and also he had a younger brother, Edmund, who is recorded in the birth records in Stratford, who was buried in Southwark Cathedral while Shakespeare was still living in London, and is described simply as an actor, but he too left no descendants. So there are two very strong links, I think, that the man who lived in Stratford certainly did have strong links with the theatre world. One of the real issues seems to have been based in old-fashioned snobbery. How could a glover's son from an obscure Midlands town have knowledge of the life of the royal court, travel in Italy, procedures in the law courts? The documentary evidence of his work as a theatrical manager, as an actor, a property owner, a tax dodger, combined with his relatively humble birth and limited education, some believe, disqualify him from being the creator of the most significant literature ever known. If the man from Stratford could not have written the plays, then who did? So we'll now move on to Francis Bacon. And the proponent of Francis Bacon was a Miss Bacon, Miss Delia Bacon, who I must emphasize did not claim any connection. She was an American lady. She was the daughter of a congregational minister in New England of Puritan stock, and she was that rare and admirable individual, a 19th century female intellectual, a teacher and public lecturer whose chosen subject was Shakespeare. And it is very important to acknowledge the intellectual milieu in which Miss Bacon worked. And this is also relevant when we come to consider De Vere. The contemporary zeitgeist had a great deal of influence, and I think we must consider it in detail. In two important literary and philosophical areas were subject to change in the early 19th century. Her book was published 2 years before Darwin's Origin of Species. It was a time of iconoclasm. Miss Bacon was aware of the analytical and philological work that had been done substantially in Germany on the 2 founding texts of European learning and religion, the works of Homer and the Bible. Decades of study by Dr. Strauss had concluded that many hands had written and translated the Bible, and that they had introduced many errors. Key tenets of Christianity were challenged, culminating in the almost unimaginable denial of the divinity of Christ. Miss Bacon had her own reasons to dispute the religious tradition in which she had been brought up. She had suffered the public humiliation of a breach of promise case at the hands of the hierarchy of the Congregational Church, in which her brother and father were ordained ministers. Her work, The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded, was published in 1857, and it challenged the literary and inevitably male establishment. And I conjecture that she may have found these ideas compelling, both personally and intellectually. If she wanted to assert herself as a female scholar and hit at what she saw as male power and complacency, the research environment of the times may have encouraged her. The textual work on the Iliad and the Odyssey was also influential. For almost 2 millennia and a half, the literate world had believed in the existence of an individual poet who wrote those founding works of European literature in about 540 BC. Homer Simpson, we all know him, don't we? He's just a reflection of the fame of Homer and his stories. They're eternal and they appear in children's books, in movies, in novels. And yet, Professor Wolff demolished permanently the myth of a single poet and demonstrated that the texts were the work of many contributors rooted in an ancient oral tradition. So this environment formed the seedbed out of which Delia Bacon's ideas grew. In addition, interest in codes was topical in mid-19th century Boston, where she lived, following the invention of the Morse code by William Morse, who was an acquaintance of Delia Bacon's. And it's also true that an interest in codes and ciphers was very popular during Shakespeare's lifetime. So it's in this atmosphere of iconoclastic intellectual inquiry that she began. Paradoxically, she was also beset by old-fashioned snobbery, and this surfaces repeatedly. She expresses contempt for the Stratford boy. She calls him the Stratford poacher, the pet horse boy, an old tradesman, an old showman and hawker of plays, and, this is worse, a stupid, illiterate, third-rate play actor. So in casting around for a credible alternative, she chose her namesake, the great 17th century Chancellor of England and confidant of James I, Francis Bacon. His essays remain important in understanding the milieu of his time, and they're frequently quoted. I think the most famous one, which most people have heard, is an essay on truth. What is truth, said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. He was everything that Will was not, educated at Cambridge and an Inn of Court, well-travelled in Europe, specifically Italy, as a diplomat and an intimate of the royal court. In addition, he was a well-known man of letters whose scientific interests included a study of codes and ciphers. Bacon described his lifetime quest as the great instauration. In a letter to his uncle, Lord Burleigh, he said, "I've taken all knowledge to be my province." In fact, he died as a result of conducting scientific experiments, I think on a chicken or a rabbit, in the snow. He was a total polymath and is regarded by some as the father of modern science. But he also wrote that the poets and historians are the best doctors, perhaps an enticing hint at his own hidden creative work. Delia Bacon believed that he was part of an anti-government group of courtiers and intellectuals, including Sir Walter Raleigh, who opposed the repressive regime of Elizabeth's Chancellor, Lord Burleigh, and his son and successor, Robert Cecil. The plays, she believed, were a challenge to the status quo and contained codes which identified the true author. This group protected themselves from the fate of Christopher Marlowe, a dissident playwright, who it is widely believed was assassinated by intelligence agents. The hiding of the true author behind the actor-manager from Stratford was a way of preserving Bacon's reputation in increasingly contentious times. Miss Bacon promised to publish the code that she had discovered. She discussed it with friends, but never put it into print. It was not included in the book, and unfortunately she fell ill in England the following year after publication, and she went back to America where she died in 1859. A number of other Americans were convinced of the authorship of Francis Bacon, among them Mark Twain. Twain was one of the earliest writers to create what we would now call a public relations campaign. and he believed that all of literature was autobiographical. He achieved fame and fortune by fictionalizing his own life. The gap between the known facts about the life of Will of Stratford and the contents of the plays convinced him to support Delia Bacon's thesis. Indeed, the question about the relationship between the writing and the life of the writer is important. Many arguments against the authorship of Will are underpinned with the assumption that much of the work is autobiographical, particularly the sonnets. And there is a modern obsession with autobiography in literature. For example, Sylvia Plath, who reads the poems, but lots of people read the books about her life. And I think that the autobiographical genre has really moved into the mainstream, but it simply was not a genre in the late 16th century. But to support this argument, the argument of the autobiographical content, many people have gone to a great deal of trouble to trace the lives of the other candidates and to fit them in locations mentioned in the texts. And I should say that I do not support this view. The author was clearly an exceptional person who drew on many sources. I do not believe that the works are particularly autobiographical. At this point, a short digression. Alternative explanations for facts accepted by the establishment easily become conspiracy theories. And the QAnon movement in the USA, I thought, was a brilliant example. Basic argument, Hillary Clinton is not a good politician, quite reasonable, can be argued. But QAnon promulgated the idea that she, with others, was responsible for keeping children in a basement somewhere in Washington of a pizza parlor to be used for nefarious purposes. And on one occasion, an armed zealot arrived at these premises in order to protect these imaginary children. And another of their claims was that Angela Merkel was a granddaughter of Hitler. I just use this to illustrate how a reasonable idea can get out of control, because the enthusiasm for codes among Miss Bacon's supporters led to the invention of weird machines which claimed to analyze the texts and identify Bacon's name embedded for posterity. And the mania for this line of inquiry led to excess. Among the victims of these fanciful ideas was Miss Elizabeth Wells Gallup, who crossed the Atlantic in the mistaken conviction that she would find a cache of Bacon's own documents concealed in a building in Islington. And Mr. Orville Ward Owen actually dredged stretches of the River Severn in the hope of finding a waterproof chest containing these elusive papers. This seems to have marked a turning point in the popularity of the Baconian cause, and despite the somewhat half-hearted support of such luminaries as Henry James, it faded from view by the mid-20th century. But one quite extraordinary outcome of these deluded endeavours was this. William Friedman, a young academic, was recruited to work in a genetics laboratory. He was drawn into the cipher issue by the laboratory director, who had been a supporter of Miss Gallup. Friedman became head of ciphers, eventually leading the training of the American military in both world wars and heading the team which cracked the Japanese code and led to victory in the Pacific. So there you are, you never know where your ideas are going to end. So now we come to the Earl of Oxford. Doesn't he look lovely? I think that's him anyway. So in 1920, a book was published called Shakespeare Identified as Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and I know that Elizabeth will have something to say at the end. The author, whose name was John Loney, unfortunately spelt Looney, but it's pronounced Loney, and his inquiries appear to be strongly influenced, again, by his personal experience, and particularly the experience of his non-religious religion. He gave up training to become a Methodist clergyman in order to join a short-lived sect called the Church of Humanity. It denied any religious metaphysicality. Instead, they worshipped the finest manifestations of the human mind. Their deities were philosophers, musicians, and of course, writers. Their meeting places were decorated with pictures and sculptures of their heroes, including Shakespeare. Unlike many other philosophical and religious groups of the late 19th century, they did not seek the advancement of the common man. They believed in benign autocracy, enlightened despotism, if you will. The sect was short-lived, and Loney, once mooted in its leader, turned to schoolmastering as a career. He taught the plays many times, and unlike Delia Bacon, who believed that the playwright was a radical, a challenger of the status quo, Loney saw a late medieval feudalist, a supporter of traditional authority, the ultimate religious and social conservative. These were the values of his church, and he transferred these to his study of Shakespeare. No doubt he particularly enjoyed Ulysses' speech in Troilus: "Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows." He had the greatest difficulty in accepting that the author of the plays could be the same man whom the record shows became a rapacious businessman in his retirement, hoarding malt, waiting for the price to rise, and pressing neighbours through the courts for relatively small debts. He interpreted the text through the prism of his own value system and clearly believed that the plays were largely autobiographical and that they reflected a worldview that he shared. It was a different kind of snobbery from that of Delia Bacon, but nonetheless, he could not believe that the money-grubbing retiree in Stratford could possibly have written these plays. So he began his search for the real playwright. Incidentally, Sigmund Freud became one of his supporters, unexpectedly expressing blatant social prejudices. He wrote to a friend that he could not believe that the plays had been written by a man whose father had a large dung heap outside his house. Now, we know about the dung heap because John Shakespeare was prosecuted for not clearing it up at the appropriate time. Loney did a thorough job reviewing possible candidates, men of probably noble or at least gentle education, known to move in literary and theatrical circles, and who were known to have experience in the areas reflected in the plays, that is, the court, the law, foreign travel. Some of you, like me, may have had the poems. Did anybody have Paul Reeve's Golden Treasury when you were at school? Your English teacher earnestly read you one every week, yes? Well, Loney used this volume in his work, and he found a poem by Edward de Vere, which he believed to be in the same metre as Venus and Adonis, which Shakespeare allegedly wrote during one of the plague lockdowns. And by the way, plenty of other poets wrote in this style, but this is the one that sparked Loney's interest. And then he embarked on research and created what became the Oxfordian School, among whose current supporters are Mark Rylance, Derek Jacobi, and Alexander Moore. Among the evidence adduced are the following points. De Vere knew the royal court from the inside. Like Lear, he had 3 daughters, amongst whom he divided his land. His handwritten notes on his copy of the Geneva Bible are of the same references used in the plays, and he is known to have travelled in Italy, in fact spent at least a year living in Venice. He also had access to libraries containing relevant classical texts, unavailable elsewhere, but apparently used by Shakespeare. But other scholars point out that the marks on the Geneva Bible are interesting, but by no means all of them correspond with quotations in Shakespeare's plays. And also, there is no way of knowing who made the marks or when. They're historic, but it's by no means certain that they were made personally by Edward de Vere. Marking up texts, writing things in the margins, underlining things was extremely common. It's ironic to us now who regard these early texts with such reverence, but they really were working volumes used by their owners in a very practical way. The tone of the sonnets suggests a connection between 2 noblemen rather than a tradesman's son reaching upwards, although this is only relevant if they are read as autobiographical. Oxford had lived as a ward in the house of Lord Burleigh and made an unhappy marriage to his daughter, and it's been suggested that his depiction of Polonius in Hamlet is a satire on Burleigh, perhaps as a protest against the wardship system, which enabled Burleigh to profiteer from Oxford's inheritance while he remained a minor. The heir to a significant estate had to have an official guardian. The official, despite his mother being alive and well, and perhaps a whole family of uncles, the official guardian was always the king or the queen, who would then sell the wardship to whoever would pay her the highest price. The guardian was allowed to use all of the income that arose from the ward's lands and grounds until they achieved their majority, and also to arrange their marriage. So you can imagine the abuse that the system was open to, and the resentment, particularly of a man like Oxford, who ended up married to his guardian's daughter and never much liked her. There's also another curious thing, which I've referred to only once, that Oxford was in trouble with Queen Elizabeth fairly often and sent away to cool himself off abroad. But she did give him a grant of £1,000 a year, which was a huge sum. and this continued into the reign of James I. Now, this is extremely mysterious because £1,000 had to be moved, and it was a vast chest full of gold coin, and it had to be moved 4 times a year to wherever he was living. And one wonders why. Because he held no high office of state, and he was often out of favour with Elizabeth. And I'll come back to this. In fact, I'll continue with it right now. This brings us to some of the excess that I referred to earlier, how a basically reasonable idea can become, perhaps, I would suggest, plain silly. It's called the Prince Tudor theory. There are 2 stages. The first is that Oxford and Elizabeth were lovers in their youth, and that the Earl of Southampton was their son, which explains why he didn't get executed along with Essex, having taken part in the Essex Rebellion. And the second, what may be called the extended argument, was that Elizabeth, who was 16 years older than Oxford, was actually his mother, his father being Edward Seymour. And presumably he was unaware of this and the incestuous relationship was not deliberate. But according to this argument, Oxford could have become Edward VII. I don't know if any of you have seen a film called Anonymous, which I only read about recently, and I managed to get up on the telly machine. But it tells that whole story, and I must say it's really quite entertaining. The horror on Oxford's face when Robert Cecil finally tells him that he was Elizabeth's son as well as her lover. It's quite worth the effort. Anyway, towards the end of his life, Loney was more explicit about his personal motive in presenting to the world De Vere, towering cultural figure who shared his fear and distaste for democracy and individualism. He believed instead that a benign authoritarian hereditary leadership would save mankind from the debased instincts of the mob. And this is ironic in that recent research has revealed much more about De Vere's life that was not particularly benign. In constructing his arguments, Loney made what many scholars believe to be a misreading of many of the characters to fit his convictions about the nature of society. He believed that the playwright had no connection with and therefore no ability to write about the lower orders. He did not appreciate the humanity of Christopher Sly in The Taming of the Shrew, or recognise the very Stratfordian references. He did not feel the humanity of Juliet's nurse, or Adam in As You Like It, or the wisdom of Twelfth Night's Feste, or Lear's Fool. As for The Tempest, with its gods, goddesses, and irascible magician hero, he denied that it was written by Shakespeare at all. His literal interpretation of Ulysses' praise of order and authority in Troilus overlooks the fact that Ulysses was deliberately flattering King Agamemnon in order to manipulate him. Loney's idealization of Oxford would have been overshadowed by more recent research, which has uncovered significant detail. The poetic courtier philosopher spent much of his life in exile from court. He certainly patronised acting companies and wrote verse. He is mentioned in contemporary documents as a writer. He also stabbed one of his own servants to death and expended much energy in trying to acquire posts or sinecures in order to shore up his fragile finances. It's ironic that Loney, who despised what he describes as the Stratfordians' money-grubbing ways, should support a candidate whose avariciousness was on a far grander scale. Finally, the Earl of Oxford died in 1604. This means that, according to Loney, King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Timon of Athens, Coriolanus, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, Henry VIII, and Two Noble Kinsmen were actually written much earlier than most scholars believe, and presumably kept on file to be performed posthumously. The Oxfordian movement ebbed in the mid-20th century, but was revived in the 1970s onwards. In America, a mock trial was held in which 3 distinguished judges heard the competing claims of Oxford and Will won by a whisker. The exercise was repeated in London. But I think it's interesting that the Oxfordian movement gained ground significantly in the US at a time when the Watergate scandal, following closely on the heels of the debacle in Vietnam, had undermined the acceptance of hierarchy and authority. And actually, I was working in New York in the early 70s, and I can remember a very powerful anti-government, anti-establishment atmosphere. The US was seething with challenges to orthodoxy. It also occurred at a time when it has flourished in a period of exploding media, which have been usefully employed. Finally, on the subject of viewpoint, ironically, I first discovered, there's the Earl of Southampton, I first encountered the De Vere Society at the home of Claire Asquith, who is the Countess of Oxford, and her husband is the Earl of Oxford. Now, actually, they're not direct descendants. There was a dogleg, and the title was reintroduced at a later stage. But ironically, she does not believe that the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare, but she has her own prejudices, and she also believes in codes. And I just use this as an example of how competing pre-experience prejudices can affect judgment. She's written 2 books about the Shakespeare family being very keen Catholics and involved in a group of intellectuals, and that there are codes in the plays, but far from claiming to be either Bacon or the Earl of Oxford, they do support the Catholic cause in very dangerous times. And if you go to one of her seminars, you'll find one of her speakers is always somebody from the Jesuit University in America. I just offer that as an example of the way in which the zeitgeist affects judgment. And of course, she may be right. I'm not saying she's not. The third of our candidates is Sir Henry Neville. And he lived near Windsor. He was a descendant of the Nevilles, who are depicted so valiantly in the history plays. And like De Vere, had first-hand experience of court, diplomatic travel, literature, and his dates are more convincing, 1562 to 1615. He was educated at Oxford, and he had access to the most recent texts and translations, which may not have been available to Will. In his time, his branch of the family had declined to less prominence than in the past, and he was related to Sir Thomas Gresham, who founded Gresham College in the city, which some of you may know. He was a close friend of the Earl of Southampton, and indeed he spent about 3 years in the Tower with Southampton after the Essex Rebellion. And he has been proposed by a scholar called Brenda James as recently as 2005. And she found some documents in the Lincolnshire Records Office, which sent her on her quest. And she ascribes to Neville intimate knowledge of royal rituals, which she believes could not have been earned by anyone other than an insider of the court. But she does raise quite an entertaining picture. She has discovered that Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, was very distantly related to Lord Bergavenny, who was Neville's grandfather. And she proposes that perhaps that's how the two met, because it does intrigue me, how could a fine gentleman persuade a jobbing theatrical type to take on the mantle of authorship and keep it completely secret for all those years? There's no reference to it. There's no, and considering the competitive nature and the relationships between the London impresarios and actors and writers, it's amazing that nobody squeaked. And she suggests that, well, that through the family, they may have made a connection. So I was imagining a sort of family Christmas party with Lord Bergavenny and many anti-Stratfordians see Will as a pretty uncouth country type. Did they meet over the drinks on Christmas morning, you know, and did Lord Bergavenny say, by the way, Will, would you like to make a quid or two, you know? And I should say that in the play, Anonymous, it's really very funny. Shakespeare is a total deadbeat. He's a hanger-on at the theatre, but he drinks and he's illiterate. He can't read something somebody puts in front of his face, and he just milks Oxford for money, and Oxford keeps having to hand over bags of gold coins to keep him quiet, and it goes totally to his head and he rampages all around London. So how did the arrangement ever work, if indeed an arrangement did? So a compelling case can be made for attributing Shakespeare's knowledge of the court, the law, and his inaccurate geographical information, particularly of Italy, to his wide acquaintance and voracious reading habits. Inaccuracies abound, suggesting a lack of actual personal experience. And in All's Well That Ends Well, he has Helen travelling from Italy to France via Compostela in Spain. He gives landlocked Bohemia a seacoast in A Winter's Tale. And a contemporary described him as always a haunter of bookshops. And the fruits of his reading are obvious, both of recent publications and the classical texts of his school days. Critics argue that he could not have acquired such knowledge from random reading. And it's very interesting the language people use. Things like random reading are used by those who want to discredit the intellectual knowledge that he gained. It's one of the many frustrations that we simply do not know where he found many of his sources, but we do know that there were book collections all over London. And because we don't know, we cannot assume that he had no access. And always remember that whoever he was an exceptional person whose gifts were well beyond the average. His success depended on knowledge, and he clearly had the drive to acquire it. And I might just throw in here, I was a teacher for 42 years in a very wide range of schools. I can say honestly, from the least to the most privileged, and I've taught children as well as adults. And I can tell you, brilliance is very rare, but it comes from anywhere. It's not the property of any particular class or profession or region. And I can believe in the brilliance of the glover's son who had a dunghill outside his house. So he wasn't a courtier, but he interacted regularly with court functionaries, for example, the Master of the Revels and the Lord Chamberlain, who was his company's patron, and whose responsibility it was to read and censor the play scripts before the plays could be performed. He appeared frequently at court to perform for special occasions like Christmas and royal betrothals. The sumptuary laws decreeing the types of dress allowed to various ranks of society meant that aristocrats and royalty were easily recognisable. And it was a law designed to keep the workers in their place and also to improve the wool trade, because every now and again it was reissued and everyone was compelled to wear a cap made of wool. But the colours and style of dress made the aristocratic class very obvious as they moved around the tiny city of London. And I've no doubt that as today, the readership of The Sun and so on is substantial. I've no doubt that in his day, the scandals and the rise and fall of aristocrats were much talked about. And the perfidy of courtiers eager to rise was the stuff of legend, as was the perfidy of lawyers. And I don't doubt that a tradesman's son from Stratford had plenty of opportunity to learn all he needed about the doings of the fine gentlemen of his day. It's possible that he was a friend of the Italian Secretary of Southampton, John Folio, and he would have been a good source. And another friend, a boy from Stratford, 2 years ahead of him at the grammar school, called Richard Field, ran a successful printing business in the intellectually and socially prestigious area, the former monastery of Blackfriars. And this is where Shakespeare eventually bought his only London property right towards the end of his time in London. The names of the characters in Love's Labour's Lost come straight from one of Field's publications, and Shakespeare's Italian phrases can be traced to the Campo de Fio, a teaching textbook also produced by Field. We can find opportunities for Will to learn about the worlds revealed in the plays, but it is difficult to attribute the knowledge and references to rural Warwickshire, which occur repeatedly in his works, to anyone but a native of the region. Aristocrats and Lord Chancellors rarely make topographical and name references to obscure locations where they have no personal connections. There are many examples. In As You Like It, the Ardennes forest in France, which was his source material, becomes the Forest of Arden, adjacent to Stratford and the ancestral home of his mother. The names Bardolph and Fluellen appear alongside Shakespeare's father in a 1592 court summons for non-attendance at church. Falstaff's famous and delightful recruiting scene in Henry IV includes topographical references to Hinckley Fair and to local legal cases involving the Visor family of Woodmancote and the Perks family of nearby Stinchcombe Hill. In the opening scene of The Taming of the Shrew, Christopher Sly gives his birthplace as Barton Heath, a village where Shakespeare had relatives. Sly gives the name of Marion Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincot, as a witness, and there are records of the Hackett family in Wincot in the 1590s. The dominant imagery in a number of the plays is rural in tone, gardening frequently used as a metaphor. In Henry VI, Queen Margaret advises, "Now 'tis the spring and weeds are shallow-rooted, aren't they just? Suffer them now and they'll overgrow the garden and choke the herbs for want of husbandry." He also describes the poor, the outsider, and reveals an uncommon sensitivity. In Richard II, he imagines the prisoner who hopes that his vain, weak nails may tear a passage through the flinty ribs. In Julius Caesar, he shows the exploitation by the powerful of the poor, as subtle masters do stir up their servants to an act of rage. Probably the most famous contemporary reference to Shakespeare was made by his jealous rival, Robert Greene. For there is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out bland verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Jonah's factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake seeing in the country. Now, this is an interesting problem. Tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide is a quote from Henry VI. And it's usually used, this quote is usually used to verify the existence of Shakespeare and is taken by Stratfordians to be evidence. But supposing what Green is really objecting to is not a writer who is more successful than he is, but a plagiarist who is pretending to be a writer, we'll never know. So we have to ask ourselves, has a fine gentleman successfully disguised his authorship of the plays in the incestuous environment of the London theatrical and literary world, where there was constant competition and rivalry? Has such a deception gone unnoticed, or is it common knowledge that Shakespeare's name was attached to other men's work and therefore needed no comment? The character and accomplishments of Ben Jonson deserve much more space than could be allowed here. I merely ask if this contentious, pugnacious rival and admirer of Shakespeare could have been persuaded or even bribed to write the introduction to the Folio describing Shakespeare as the soul of the age. It's been suggested, but there is no proof that Shakespeare and Jonson were anything other than rivals. Jonson had a reputation for physical and verbal violence. This could support the view that he was a bad character and could have been willing to be bought by whichever wealthy nobleman was willing to pay for his cooperation. But then why would he have continued the deception 19 years after the Earl of Oxford died? It's true that so much about Shakespeare's life is unknown, and many earnest scholars have written millions of words trying to fill these gaps. The 10 years of his early adult life remain a mystery, despite the theories that he worked as a lawyer's clerk, he was a soldier in Europe, and that he was a tutor and part-time actor in a Catholic household in Lancashire. For what it's worth, I think that the most likely explanation is that he joined the group of players, which included his eventual partner, James Burbage, on one of their frequent visits to Stratford. Now, we long for documentary evidence. We all hope that further discoveries, which will tell us more, unlikely though it may seem, will come to light. And it does sometimes appear, and I came across this quite by chance, a publication in 2015, which showed that Jonson and Shakespeare were actually friends. There are several references to the social, if perhaps combative, relationship between the two. But the article I've read recently was uncovered by a Professor Martha Carlin in the 1990s at the University Library in Edinburgh. The document is a collection of 27 pages of handwritten notes of a young London antiquarian working in the 1640s. So that's 24 years after Shakespeare died. He records finding graffiti carved into the timbers of the Tabard Inn in Southwark. The Tabard Inn used as a starting place for the Canterbury Tales. And it's known that both Jonson and Shakespeare were great admirers of Chaucer. So it seems that it was a regular meeting place where they could relax, to roister, as it says in the text of these notes. And with Richard Burbage and the later actor Lawrence Fletcher, they carved their names into the panelling, possibly as a homage to the father of English poetry and possibly following several pints of beer. Interestingly, carving your name into ancient and valuable artifacts was very common, viz. The throne in the close-ups to the coronation is completely covered in graffiti, as is the boot room at Eton, with lots of later very famous names going back hundreds of years. And I checked with Martha Carlin recently, and she remains convinced that these graffiti were genuine, and the notes are genuine. Finally, the accusation that Will of Stratford had too little learning, indeed, possibly was illiterate. Intellectual and social snobbery, belittling the character of Shakespeare, can be traced through most of the arguments against the Stratfordian author. Richard Green may have started it, calling him an upstart crow, and his actual friend Ben Jonson did talk about his small Latin and less Greek. And yet the academic and biographer Jonathan Bate describes the grammar school curriculum taught at King's School, Stratford, as equipping its pupils with a higher standard of Latin than is now typical of graduates in the classics departments of universities. And although there is no definite proof that he attended the grammar school, given that his father was an alderman and then mayor of the town, given that his father processed in grand style, accompanied by his family and other aldermen, to church on Sundays, I think it very unlikely that his father didn't send him to the one and only school that was available. So the classes began at 7 in summer and 7 in winter, 6 days a week. The curriculum was standardized. It was even worse than the national curriculum. It had been written by a master at St. Paul's. It concentrated in the early years on rote learning, and the scene in The Merry Wife of Windsor with the Welsh schoolmaster seems to reflect Shakespeare's own Welsh schoolmaster. And incidentally, members of the nobility and upper gentry didn't go to school. They had tutors at home. The curriculum moved on to the Latin authors and plays, and they certainly studied both Ovid and Horace and did a lot of amateur play acting. Anti-Stratfordians make much of the fact that there's no reference to books or plays in his will, and this is one of the gaps that causes headaches for the Stratfordians. Given that his wife and daughters were more or less illiterate, it is not surprising that he did not entrust them with literary materials. He had spent most of his life living alone in London, shouldering a huge workload, which probably included managing, performing, rehearsing, negotiating the legal and administrative responsibilities, placating the master of revels, pleasing the company patrons, auditioning new actors, and keeping a wary eye on rival theatres and playwrights. Unlike many of his colleagues, he never set up home in London, living in various lodgings until he purchased an apartment at Blackfriars, almost at the end. He may also have engaged in love affairs of various kinds. It's impossible to know much about his home life in Stratford, although it's clear that he remained attached to his home and family. A man doesn't buy the second biggest house in his hometown unless he has a real attachment to it. Apparently it had 20 bedrooms. So if he really didn't like his wife much, they wouldn't have had to meet very often, I guess. He was a social climber, eventually acquiring a coat of arms, which entitled him to call himself a gentleman. Having returned home, he set about making more money through agricultural dealings. The malt hoardings attracted criticism, but it was simply common practice at the time. So much of the authorship debate relies on speculation, so I will speculate here. It's not difficult to believe that Stratford was always his home nest, a relief from the intensity of London life. Why would he have transported his archive from his place of business to a home where no one could or would read it? In any case, the texts would have been seen as company property. Although a number of contemporary wills do bequeath books, many medieval and early modern wills lack reference to property known to have existed. Testators had often dispersed property before their wills were written. And if there is any truth in the story that Ben Jonson visited him towards the end of his life to do a bit of roistering, he may have returned to London with a bag full of paperwork. In the material that I have read, assertions in support of all of the candidates include phrases like, "It may be assumed that," "It is likely that," and I have used similar phrases myself. After a gap of 400 years, so much has been lost and can never be retrieved. I recently heard a recording of Hilary Mantel answering questions about her book, All Four. She said that in the end, we are all just stories. If you want to know just how varied those stories are, loiter at a funeral reception and listen to the mourners discussing the deceased. So many different versions of the life and character will be told by the survivors. It's impossible to know the objective truth about anyone else's life. We can only do our best to evaluate the evidence. We must try to disengage ourselves from lazy thinking and grain prejudice, and perhaps also to ask ourselves in this case, does it matter? Whoever he was, he had an exceptional mind, and he continues to stir the hearts and minds of men and women throughout the world. Rather than seeing his work as an extended autobiography, I see it as the fruit of voracious reading and a powerful imagination. His influence crosses religious, racial, and political boundaries, and he's possibly the most influential human being who ever lived. So I'll finish with a quote from A Midsummer Night's Dream. The warrior Duke Theseus, a man of action, says, "The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." So it's up to you to decide who you think wrote it. That's it. Thank you.
We've got time for some questions, if anyone would like to challenge. And also there might be some questions from our Zoom audience.
Do you want to go up there, Hamish, and let them know?
Are there any questions from?
There are no questions online.
There are no questions online. Yes.
This is not a planted question. We know that some of the plays were collaborations, such as Henry VIII, the two that the what scope is there for there being more collaboration in producing these plays by a busy company that's looking to get its audience?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes.
Any other people have been involved?
Right, so this is a question about collaborators. It's known that in Henry VIII, particularly in Titus Andronicus, he worked with collaborators. I think there's a great deal of scope for collaboration, and I didn't have time to get into that, but I think it's very likely that there was a lot more collaboration than we know with a wider range of people. It's possible that one of the alternative candidates did collaborate with Shakespeare. Any other questions?
Any others?
Do you have any idea about the thousand year that feels of the play?
Well,
Repeat the question.
yes. Do we have any idea why Elizabeth paid him the huge amount of £1,000 a year as an annuity, particularly at a time when the Exchequer was very fully stretched and there was a lot of discontent about the financial state of the government? Well, I have no idea, but if she thought he was her son, or if she thought that he was the father of their son, I think that has been proposed as a possible explanation. I think it's one of the things we'll absolutely never know.
Some sort of scandal anyway.
It suggests a scandal, but who can say? Do we?
Yes.
I think you said sort of at the beginning of your talk, you researched it, caused you to have doubts.
Yes, yes.
And I wondered what was the main.
The very annoying absence. Oh, sorry. So I have had, sorry, the questioner asks, I said at the beginning that I am more doubtful than I was, having done a great deal of reading for this talk. I think it's the absence of any reference or marked text with his name on, because one of the things I'm particularly interested in is early books, both manuscripts and early printed books, and all sorts of interesting things pop up in all kinds of places, often very much detached from their origins, often acquired in the libraries of local bibliophiles, for example, and there are none, and I find that very vexing. There is his name on some of the quarto texts, which is a whole variety of things, individual part copies, prompt copies, pirated copies, and his name does occur as an actor in some of the small parts, which is why people say he was Yorick in Hamlet, and he was Adam in As You Like It, which is a typical thing a producer or writer might do, in that the cast was limited in number and he might well have stepped up onto the stage fairly often to fill in some of the smaller parts. But I would dearly love somewhere, somehow, a book to turn up with his name in it. His signatures are very scruffy. And again, many anti-Stratfordians believe that this is evidence of the fact that he wasn't even very literate. Or perhaps he just had lazy habits, bad handwriting, yes. Also, the name is interesting. Apparently, names printed with a hyphen in the middle were often a sign that it was a pseudonym. But I've also heard from another scholar that the typography at the time meant that the letters would have collided in the middle of the name. So he added the E in the middle to separate the printed letters. Who knows?
The question.
David.
Basically, two reasons why. One is in lack of education. The other one you just referred to is evidence. I just wonder why other writers have not been challenged in this area. Pepys, nobody ever says, did Pepys write his tasks? Is there some reason why Shakespeare attracted this?
I think because why has Shakespeare attracted questions about his authorship, whereas other great writers haven't? Well, perhaps that in their case, in Pepys' case, his life is an open book, and but there's lots of evidence of him as a human being and where he lived and what he did and what his work was and which events he witnessed. And because there is so little, Shakespeare is so enigmatic. There is so little about his daily life, what he did and where he did it, which is why the recent books focusing on a particular year in his life, for example, using the very scant legal records to build a picture. They're so fascinating because of the big gap, and also because he's so significant. I think it's indisputable that he's the most significant writer in the world has ever known, and all of us, in our DNA, we have these expressions and newly minted words. There's enormous discussion about the number of words that he created and about the range of his vocabulary. So I won't offer any figures now, except to say he knew an awful lot of words and he invented a lot more, which we all use daily.
Sorry.
So there's a question at the back.
Okay,
Yeah. Yes, hello.
Hello. I'm interested in mysticism. I don't know that much about Shakespeare. I noticed from time Shakespearean quotes kind of here in the context of the mystics and things like nothing is good and bad, and we think the life is a tragedy, tale told by a fool. It seems that Shakespeare has a profound insight into the sort of the bigger questions of life, which again makes a very interesting study, because where did those influences come from? Or if you believe in reincarnation, maybe he's a reincarnation of some profound scholar from earlier times. There's that whole other scene in his work.
That's very interesting. The question is about the influence that Shakespeare's words have on mystic writing. And you point out that he seems to have an exceptional insight into human nature and human experience. And I think that's the whole point. That's why his plays are constantly performed both in Europe and English-speaking countries, and with different style and sometimes different interpretations all the way around the world, because they do speak to real human beings of real experience. And I don't know which mystic writers you have in mind, but presumably they're aiming to do the same thing, to explore what it is to be a human being.
I think I'm going to draw us to a close now. What an astonishing scholarship has been displayed to us today. It's the depths of Lynne's knowledge and her ability to answer any question with even more knowledge is quite astonishing. And I'd like to thank you so much for your research and for giving us such well, perplexing, really,
Yes.
talk. So thank you very much.